me more than the human beings who devote themselves and their time to a dissection of public morals, says the Sunday newspaper columnist. I can understand social workers who are concerned about drugs, alcoholism, or illegitimate children. But I've never been able to follow the thinking of people who have a burning urge to coerce others to their way of thought. Fanaticism of any kind makes me cringe, and to dictate to others how they should live strikes me as the height of arrogance. Each man to his own way of life is my motto, and if the Reformed churches in South Africa's Commission of Public Morality want to go ahead and hold a conference on public morality, that's their affair. But when they want to enforce their views on all South Africans, which was never the idea, by the way, this permissive columnist refuses to be submissive and has a strong desire to be dismissive. I must admit that I would like to be present at the University of Pretoria when Dr. Nigel Lee presents his paper on Sunday observance. When I read the outline of it, I could not believe that any speaker in 1970 could deliver it without the audience bursting into screams of laughter. Here are a few of the points. No swimming on Sundays, no Sunday trade, no buying of gas, not even to drive to church, no unnecessary cooking or preparation of food, no wearing of informal clothes in public, no purely social visits to friends, no visits to restaurants or tea rooms or public swimming baths, no fishing, sports, or outdoor recreation. Withdrawal from all so-called worldly activities normally practiced on weekdays. No buying, receiving, or reading of Sunday newspapers. No books or magazines to be read, except, suggests Dr. Lee, those with a positively Christian material, such as the magazine known as the Church Messenger. Maybe I'm round the bend, says the columnist, but this catalogue of thou shalt not strikes me as something out of Walt Disney's Fantasia. I saw Fantasia recently for the second time in my life, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Well, I must admit to a personal bias, because I would soon be out of a job as a Sunday newspaper columnist if readers of my column were to switch to reading the Church Messenger on Sunday. That's true. The no informal clothes in public bit also affects me, as I haven't appeared in a formal ensemble since the 1948 New Look. I can live without visits to public swimming baths, for the very idea of a public swimming bath fills me with nausea. And that goes for fishing on Sundays or on any other day of the week for that matter. It would not break my heart to cut out cooking and the unnecessary preparation of food. I also seldom pay social visits to friends on Sundays because I'm too busy lolling around reading the Sunday newspapers and pursuing worldly activities like buying gas to go to the restaurant to fetch the tonics that I forgot to order in the Saturday rush. I really can't see why it's moral to drag some poor harmless fish out of the water on Saturday, but immoral to do it on Sunday. But I can see a grim time coming if Dr. Lee and his pals get their way. Unquote. Well now, what saith the Scripture? And we're dealing in the Scriptures with the role of the state, if any, regarding Sunday legislation. First of all, I would like to read a couple of passages from Genesis, starting Genesis 5, verse 28. Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. When Noah comes, he will bring and promote Sabbath keeping. Well, Noah came. We'll read about him in the next chapter, Genesis 6, verse 18. But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and and thy wife and thy son's wife with thee. Everybody who would be spared to populate the new earth after the flood, without exception, came into the Sabbath-keeping ark, as we will shortly see. And of course, of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. So even the animals benefit when man keeps the Sabbath. Chapter 7, verse 4, For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off of the face of the earth. Verse 10, It came to pass, after 7 days, that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. Chapter 8, verse 6, And it came to pass at the end of 40 days, that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. And he sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters were dried up from off of the earth. He also sent forth a dove from him, to see if the waters were abated from off of the face of the ground. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned unto Noah into the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Then Noah put forth his hand, and took her, and pulled her in unto him into the ark. And he stayed, hesitated, waited, yet other 7 days. And again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came in to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off of the earth. And Noah stayed yet other 7 days, and he sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him any more. And they came out of the ark on what was also a Sabbath, as I've hopefully succeeded in demonstrating in a previous lecture. And verse 22, when Noah and his family and everybody who was on earth then brought their sacrifices to the Lord, God promised, verse 22, while the earth remaineth, that is, right down till the second coming of the Lord, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night, by implication Sabbath day and work day, shall not cease, lo yishbat, shall not stop Sabbathing. Exactly what the Hebrews said. Now notice, in the next chapter, we're told that Noah was the governor of the earth, and he governed all the people still alive on the earth, so that the state as an institution of God the root of it can be sought in this very chapter, right after the Sabbath-keeping chapter. Genesis 9, verse 5. Surely, says God, your blood of your hands will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. So if A murders B, the community are to take care of A. That, you see, is the root of the state. Punishment for those who disturb law and order. And you, verse 7, be ye fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply therein. In other words, labor for 6 days, and rest on the Sabbath, like Adam, the first Noah, had done previously. And then finally, I won't read it again, verse 13, God sets his rainbow in the cloud, 7-colored rainbow, sealing all of this. Incidentally, for all people, and even for all animals everywhere. Next, I'd like to draw your attention to Exodus 20, verse 10. The 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter. Please note that Sabbath keeping is not a matter for you personally and individually. If you are a parent, you are to encourage very strongly your children to keep the Sabbath. because you're in a position of authority over them. And further, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, and now the operative word, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. Gates here does not mean doorposts of your house. Gates means the city gates of the wall around the city. In other words, the city fathers, the municipal, local governmental authorities were not to allow the strangers, the non-citizens, living in the true religious community to desecrate the Sabbath. It's very clear. Nor thy strangers within thy gates. In this connection, also Deuteronomy 5, verse 14, that seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thine ox, nor thine ass, nor any of thy cattle, nor thy strangers that is within their gates, within thy gates, so that thy manservant and thy maidservant may rest, as well as thou. Then I'd like us, please, to turn to Jeremiah chapter 17. Jeremiah chapter 17. We read the whole thing this morning. I'll just read one verse now. Thus said the Lord unto me, Jeremiah, go and stand in the gate of the children of the people. Go stand in the city gates. Go stand in the gate whereby the kings of Judah, the political leaders, come in, and by the which they go out, and in all the gates of Jerusalem, and say unto them, amongst other things, verse 21, go tell the authority of the kings of Judah, all the inhabitants, go tell them, verse 21, take heed to yourselves, and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gate of Jerusalem. There must be no public desecration of the Sabbath. And the political leaders are required to enforce this. Let us also turn to Nehemiah chapter 9. Nehemiah chapter 9. Verse 13. Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments and true laws, good statutes and commandments, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandest them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hand of Moses thy servant. Nehemiah 10, verse 29. This is a very interesting text, by the way, that the old Scottish Covenant is frequently quoted when God's people, the political leaders, entered into a national covenant with God, with political implications. Nehemiah 10:29. They clave to their brethren, to their nobles, their political leaders, and they entered into a curse and into an oath to walk in God's law. In other words, they took a vote. They used their political authority via the ballot, such as were enfranchised, requiring the nobles and the people to walk in God's law, the law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and to do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord, and His judgments and His statutes, and that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy it of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day, and that we would leave the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. Nehemiah 13, beginning verse 14. Nehemiah was the political governor of Judah. That's an important point. Let me understrike that again. Nehemiah was the political governor of Judah, and you'll see he's going to require the local governments in the various cities, and particularly in Jerusalem, to take action to prevent public Sabbath desecration. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God, and for the offices thereof. In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves, and lading asses, as also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. Notice Nehemiah doesn't immediately mow them down with a submachine gun. That is not the Reformed way. Start by reasoning with these people and pointing out where they're in error. And then after that you turn down the screws progressively. 16. There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I, Nehemiah, the governor, contended with the nobles of Judah, with the mayors of the various cities in the province of Judah. I contended with the local government that would not enforce the law of God. And I said unto them, and this is another interesting thing, the central government is not trying to legislate throughout the land. The central government that's right here is trying to get the local government to establish the law of God locally. It's another interesting principle. So I contended with the nobles of Judah, and I said unto them, what evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Nehemiah holds the local mayors responsible for allowing other people to trade, as if they, the mayors themselves, had broken the Sabbath. Did not your fathers do this? And did not our God bring all of this evil upon us and upon this city? It means the prior destruction of Jerusalem and the exile, which you recall was because the people of God had broken the Sabbath. That was the root cause of the exile into Babylonian captivity. And yet, says Nehemiah, end of verse 18, ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, and again notice Nehemiah is still not reaching for his submachine gun, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and I charged that those gates should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And some of my servants did I set at the gates, so that there should be no burden brought in through the gates of the city on the Sabbath day. But the merchants had still not given up the fight. Verse 20. So the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of ware lodged outside of Jerusalem once or twice. So as soon as the Sabbath was gone, they could go in, and of course their very camping there disturbed the rest of the other people inside of the city. And they did this once and twice. 21. Then I testified against them, and I said unto them, why are you lodging outside and all around the city wall? If you do so again is anti-revolutionary, he's not mowing them down yet, step by step, and this is the principle of church discipline and of political action. Go slow, go slow. Go, by all means go, but go slow. Don't go faster than the people that you want to lead. If you do this again, I will lay hands on you. And he had the political authority to do this. From this, don't make threats that you can't execute. From that time forth, they no more came on the Sabbath, because they knew Nehemiah could do that, and he would do that. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep or guard the city gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this too, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. And now I'm winding up. Romans 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained by God. Interesting, it says powers, not so much the central government, Caesar, but the local government, the powers, plural, but they're ordained by God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers, plural, are not a terror to good works. To keep the Ten Commandments, you shouldn't be afraid of a local government. But they are a terror to the evil works. And if people want to break the Sabbath publicly, then the rulers should put the fear of God into them. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Very well. Do thou that which is good. Keep the Ten Commandments, including the fourth, and thou shalt have praise of the ruler. So a good Christian government should praise Sabbath-keeping citizens and make life tough for such of its citizens who publicly desecrate the Sabbath rest. Notice, it doesn't mean the government must force everybody to go to church, but it does mean that the government, and it shouldn't try to do that, because the government is state government. The church should force its members to go to church and cut them off if they won't go to church, yes. The church should invite its non-members to come to church, but can't act against them if they won't. The state, I don't believe, should ever try to force anybody, not even Christians, to go to church. But the state should very definitely punish citizens, whether they have the vote or not, who publicly desecrate the Sabbath and upset the Christian section of the citizenry. That's the principle. And therefore ye must needs be subject, or rather verse 4, for he, the local government, is a minister of God to thee for good. Notice this is not government by the people, of the people, for the people so much. Certainly the people are benefited by the government. Certainly it's government for that particular group of people and by them, but in the first analysis it's government of God, by God, through God, and unto God, and only when government is that way will the people be really benefited. He's a minister of God to thee for good, but if thou do that which is evil, you're going to break the Sabbath commandment and the others publicly, well, be afraid. For he, the government, does not bear the sword in vain. He is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore, ye must needs be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. Don't desecrate the Sabbath publicly, not just because a decent government would punish you for doing that, but because your very conscience should want you to obey a decent government, apart from the possibility of getting punished. Finally, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1, I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority. Pray for the government. Well, why? So that we may lead a quiet and a peaceable life. So that we may lead a quiet, restful, Sabbath-like, and a peaceable life. A shalom, Shabbat life in all godliness, all keeping of God's commandment, and honesty. Now then, perhaps I should just see if we can start off with a suitable quotation. I must say I often feel that having read the Scriptures, there really isn't anything left to say. And what can I say when God's already said it? However, let's try and say something. In 1620, the English Puritan exiles left the Netherlands for the New World. In spite of the accession of James I to the throne of England in 1603, and his commissioning of the authorized version of the English Bible of 1611, James made life in England very difficult for the Puritans. His most irritating measure, they thought, was his Book of Sports of 1618, in which he encouraged Sunday sports, dancing, May games, maypoles, and athletics, adding that it was his wish that the bishop of that diocese, episcopacy being the state religion then, take the like straight order with all of the Puritans, either constraining them to conform to Sabbath desecration or otherwise leave the country. Well, the Puritans, God bless them, would not conform themselves. They chose rather to leave the country, and a constant stream of nonconformist refugees left England for the Netherlands from 1607 onward, and thence from the Netherlands to New England from 1620 onwards. While in the Netherlands, the English Baptists drew up a declaration of faith of English people remaining at Amsterdam, Holland, in 1611, which provided for weekly assembly, prophecy, and breaking of bread upon every first day of the week, being the Lord's Day, upon which day they ought not to labor in their callings according to the equity of the moral law, which Christ came not to abolish, but to fulfill. Exodus 28. And then other Puritan nonconformists too all left Holland for New England from 1620 onwards, and after signing the Mayflower Compact in the best Scottish covenanting tradition, they formally landed in Connecticut and Massachusetts and adopted the Bible as the code of civil law for the new colony. Now, these early American laws, coupled with the strict decalogical writings of New England men like Tom Shepherd in his Sabbath Theses of 1634, were strict. In 1652, Governor Eaton enacted that whosoever shall profane the Lord's Day or any part of it by work or sport shall be punished by fine or corporally. But if the court, by clear evidence, find that the sin was proudly, presumptuously, and even with a high hand committed against the command and authority of the blessed God, such person, therein despising and reproaching the Lord, shall be put to death. Now, the legislation of Moses, by that I mean the Mosaic legislation, the ceremonial law, Exodus 20 through Deuteronomy 24, this ceremonial law of Moses, even in respect of the state's calling to sanctify the Sabbath in public life, has all been fulfilled in Christ. And for this reason, it has been abolished and nailed to the cross. Colossians 2. However, as I said the other day, Rushduni points out in his book on biblical law, and I think he's right on this particular point in that particular book, there are certain general nailed to the cross. We must also consider the tremendous pre-Mosaic texts of political significance, Genesis 1 through Exodus 20, or should I rather say pre-ceremonial texts, as well as the great amount of post-ceremonial Old Testament material found in Deuteronomy 29 through Malachi 4. Don't think that when Jeremiah and Nehemiah and Isaiah wrote about the Sabbath that all of what they said related to the temporary ceremonial law. Oh no. We believe as covenanters that there's one covenant of grace from Adam through the second Adam, in spite of a temporary Mosaic dispensation, as opposed to the pre-Mosaic dispensation and the post-Mosaic dispensation from Joshua through Malachi of that one and the same covenant. So then, the provisions revealed in God's Word for the government's role in promoting public Sabbath keeping and in punishing public Sabbath desecration, such as were revealed from Genesis through Exodus 20, and again from Deuteronomy 29 through Malachi, as I see it, all remain in force, as opposed to what is stated between Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 28, some of which principles too, I believe, can in the general sense also be applied today, but not in a particular sense. Now, when God made his cosmos-embracing covenant with Adam, and with that, and after that, entered into his divine Sabbath rest, until man, by way of obedience to God, would follow God into God's everlasting rest alongside of God, God called upon the whole man to yield himself wholly to the service of God, and thus also called upon man as a political being to yield the political aspect of his life to the service of God too. I may point out that although most Reformed theologians consider the state to have been instituted after the flood, that Abraham Kuyper and one Duavidian known as Spies, and even Duavius in his more mature thinking, believe it could have been instituted prior to that. Kuyper, in fact, in his two massive volumes, each that thick, Anti-Revolutionary Statecraft, makes it clear that he thinks that the state was in principle already instituted in the Garden of Eden prior to the fall, inasmuch as there would have been political authorities to control and monitor what man did. Of course, men wouldn't have broken the law, but perhaps we can understand this if we think of Adam not having fallen into sin, having invented automobiles, and perhaps there would have been some need for traffic cops or people to fix traffic lights, even though nobody would willfully ever run through a traffic light. Well, anyway, I leave that for what it's worth. We can certainly assume and know that at least after the flood onwards, the state was there to enforce the law of God to the extent to which God wanted it publicly enforced in public life. Undoubtedly, Noah, as the ruling patriarch, demanded that the whole of humanity that had of their own free will entered into the ark together with him. Well, perhaps his children didn't come in of their free will, but of course his children were already mature and married, and of course if they had had children, Noah had got grandchildren. It's inconceivable to me that they would have left the little baby grandchildren outside of the ark to drown. But anyway, everybody inside of the ark kept the Sabbath together. And leaving the ark, all people brought sacrifice to the Lord. And the Lord gave the rainbow covenant, the seven-colored rainbow covenant, to all people, also for the benefit of animals. And then the Lord formally instituted the government at that point in respect of whoever kills another, his blood shall be shed by man. So too we saw, did we not, that in the permanent Decalogue which is given us, the fourth commandment, that we are to keep the Sabbath, that our children are to keep the Sabbath, that we are to cause our children to keep the Sabbath, and that we are to cause strangers that are within our city gates not to do anything inappropriate on the Sabbath day too. This is stated both in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5. And I think something of this is reflected in the Westminster Larger Catechism, question 124, which says, well, what are meant by father and mother in the fifth commandment? Thou shalt keep the Sabbath, and thy son and thy daughter. Well, by father and mother in the fifth commandment are meant not only natural parents, but all superiors in age and gift, especially such as by God's ordinance are over us in places of authority, whether in family, church, or commonwealth. So you see, this thing begins to get political overtones now. Notice also in question 129, what is required of superiors towards their inferiors? Well, it is required of superiors according to that power they receive from God And that relation wherein they stand to love, pray for, and bless their inferiors, to instruct, countenance, and admonish them, rewarding such as do well, this is Romans 13, isn't it? And chastening and chastising such as do evil, and providing for them all things necessary for soul and body. Question 135 through 6, the duties required in the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill, are to preserve life, patient bearing of the hand of God, quietness of mind, Sabbathness of mind, cheerfulness of spirit, a sober use of sleep, labor, and recreation. And that it is forbidden to have excessive labor and recreation, and whatsoever tends to the destruction of the life of any. So if people are enslaved, the question is really whether a state should tolerate slavery when its anti-revolutionary moves to abolish it. And I really think the answer must be no. If that slavery, particularly if that slavery is a kind of slavery that works people 7 days a week, it's contrary to the law of God. Even in Old Testament Mosaic times, slaves were required to keep the Sabbath day. And for people to work people round the clock is immoral. And I think the state does have a calling under God to monitor this, according to the Bible. So too in question 118 of the larger catechism, why is the charge of keeping the Sabbath more specially directed to governors of families and other superiors? This would include the governor of the Commonwealth mentioned in the other question. Well, the charge of keeping the Sabbath is more specially directed to governors of families and other superiors because they are bound not only to keep it themselves, but they're also bound to see to it that the Sabbath be observed by all those under their charge. And because they are prone oftentimes to hinder them by employment of their own. I think it's very interesting, as we saw, to see that Jeremiah addressed himself to the kings and the nobles in respect of putting an end to allowing anybody to bring burdens through the public city gates on the Sabbath day. It was precisely the laxity of the government in respect of the public sanctification of the Sabbath that was one of the big causes of the exile, 2 Chronicles 36. But even after the exile and the final return of the people, the leaders had not yet learned their lesson. And that's why we find Nehemiah, chapter 10, calling upon the nobles, the kings, and the people to enter into a solemn curse and oath, a covenant, to see that none of them would publicly desecrate the Sabbath. And of course in Nehemiah 13, I won't deal with it again, you remember the way in which he slowly but surely, as the government turned down the screws on those immoral merchants outside of the city wall. Notice that Nehemiah held the local government personally responsible for desecrating the Sabbath, for allowing the Sabbath to be desecrated by the local citizenry and the strangers within their gates, the men of Tyre. As the general rule of New Testament practice, Abraham Kuyper suggests that government should in the first place, apart from the law of necessity, of course, promote works of necessity, but to avoid official works that are not necessary to be conducted on the Lord's Day. Secondly, says Kuyper, the army, the military, and the fleet on the Sabbath day, as far as necessity will permit it, should not be required to do service. Thirdly, silence during times of public worship must be ensured by the state. And fourthly, says Kuyper, the state, through its legislation, should arrest the conduct of worldly business in the public sector. And in the afterlife to come, Christ, the Lord of the Sabbath, will rule all nations with a staff of iron. May the prayer of every Christian, therefore, be even now, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, here and now on earth, as it is in heaven, even in respect of Sabbath desecration. I've referred to the role of government to reward the good and punish the wicked in Romans 13, and this is New Testament, not Old. I've referred to the necessity of Christians praying for governors and kings so that we can have a quiet, Sabbath-like, and peaceful existence here and now. That's New Testament teaching and not Old. And finally, may I wind up by referring you to Revelation 14:13, how we will rest from our labors when we go to heaven, and also the Sabbath of the new earth, and that we, as much as within us lies, through our strength of the vote, if we are enfranchised, when we vote for candidates at the ballot, are to use our influence to promote Sabbath keeping on this earth, even publicly, as much as we can, here and now. So then, in conclusion, I said in 1970 in public, and I shall say it again, we would like to see the state, as a minister of God, legally oblige all employers to release all of their workers from labor at least every second Sunday, as well as to release them on a weekday every second week as compensation for the Sunday on which they are required to work. To forbid all secular Sunday newspapers, to apply nationwide legislation against all public Sunday sports, dances, games, liquor trading, races, pleasure trains, pleasure buses, pleasure boats and aeroplanes, tourism, garages and gas sales, and also against all Sunday dramatic performances and film shows other than those of an exclusively Christian character. Because after all, it's the Lord's day and it's not our day. Let us then see that even in the field of government, we are in the Spirit on the Lord's day and not in the flesh. Thank you.